talk about a map or you do want to look
Oh yeah,
at something,
maps in particular.
it just really is great.
I just use a blackboard with my students, a chalk, and write up a series of Russian names before I start, and that usually gets them gripped, because I find if I give out things or PowerPoint, they're staring at the PowerPoint instead of what I'm saying.
Except you can power it up and down just to show the
you
images.
can, yeah. I'm sure it can be done properly. It's the last
But
skill.
yes, we've all seen people who get up there and they're saying, this
I
should
will
go
ever
so-"
acquire, I think, yes.
Well, I just decided, at least American students, they get to a point where they're treating you like their grandparents.
Yeah.
If you can't do it, and you almost feel like you have to be able to do it to a certain degree.
Yeah. Yeah, well.
Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Welcome to this Cold War International History Project book discussion, afternoon seminar with Jonathan Haslam and Melissa Stockdale. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the History and Public Policy program and European Studies here at the center. And it's great to see all of you. A number of your familiar faces, some less so. Glad you ventured out into the rain and made it to join us here today for what I think will be a very interesting afternoon. We're here to discuss Jonathan Haslam's new book, Russia's Cold War, From the October Revolution to the Fall of the Wall. Jonathan, of course, is professor of history of international relations at the University of Cambridge. He's a fellow at the British Academy, known to many of you through his numerous publications, including, perhaps most importantly, books on the Nixon administration and Allende, as well as The Vices of Integrity, E.H. Carr, and a history of realist thought and international relations since Machiavelli. We're delighted to have him here. He's long been involved in Cold War international history research, has participated in many of our conferences over the last 15, 20 years or so, and it's wonderful to see much of that work come to fruition with this book, and so we're looking forward to hearing from him. We then will have an initial commentary to kind of get the discussion started by Professor Melissa Stockdale, who is currently a Wilson Center Fellow and an Associate Professor of Russian and East European Studies at the University of Oklahoma when she's not here. She is a specialist in modern Russian history, has a number of publications to her credit, including Paul Milyukov and The Quest for Liberal Russia, 1880 to 1918, and My Death for the Motherland is Happiness, Women, Patriotism, and Soldiering in Russia's Great War, which was awarded the Held Best Prize for Best Article in 2004. She's currently here at the center finishing her second book entitled A Hard Country to Love, Patriotism and National Identity in Russia's Great War. And she's also co-editing a volume of essays entitled Space, Place and Power in Modern Russian History. She holds degrees from the University of Tulsa and Harvard University. So with that introduction, let me turn it over to Jonathan. Welcome to the Wilson Center, your first time here in this building. So it's a long overdue welcome, and then we'll turn to Melissa. Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Christian. I'm very indebted to the Cold War International History Project because they continue to invite me to conferences even though I produced hardly anything on the subject. So I think I can I can safely say that I finally produced, as it were. This was I suppose I've been teaching on the Soviet Union and the Cold War on and off since my career began over 30 years ago. So the ultimate product pieces were gradually assembled over a long period of time. The problem was, as it were, like a jigsaw puzzle. As I got the frame in place, most of the pieces in the middle of the jigsaw were missing. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Norwegian Nobel Institute kindly asked me to form part of a team under Arne Wedstad, who was then at the Institute, to help the Russians declassify their foreign ministry archive. And we went to Moscow in great hope. One German, who was like a panzer tank, myself, Arne Wedstad, another Norwegian, Bill Taubman, a sort of multinational team, and we struggled with the foreign ministry archive for 5 years, 4.5 years, to arrange declassification of materials. Then the first Chechen War happened, and we accused the head of the archive, then Mr. Lebedev, of reclassifying the materials we had spent $200,000 having declassified. He said, no, we've agreed, we have declassified, but we have removed them from availability. And then the second Chechen War, which is no accident, which was a prelude to Putin's rule, really, ensured that the secret police thereafter controlled the whole archival production process. It doesn't mean material didn't come out, but it came out in bits and pieces. And therefore, I was very reluctant to mortgage the rest of my career from the early 90s on producing a book such as this. So I got on with other work, including one chapter of the Cold War book, which was the book on Allende. And when one chapter turned into a book, I realized this couldn't go on. And I'd acquired too much material. And so this book is actually 2/3 of a book that originally Yale had, but I was hacked away at in order to reduce it. So there's a great deal of material. The material inevitably is a little uneven, and I had to cut out most of the interwar period in order to see it into print. But my basic argument is, as I think I probably always believed from my first work on the Soviet Union in the 1970s, I worked on Anglo-Soviet relations in the 20s, and it occurred to me how like Anglo-Soviet relations in the 20s was with Western Soviet relations in the 1970s, the collapse of détente. The same language was used. Pravda almost read the same if you substituted names. There were war scares, and there were war scares in the early 80s. And anybody studying Anglo-Soviet relations in the 20s had to think, living in the 1970s, all this sounds horribly familiar. How could this be horribly familiar if the Soviet Union was in some sense fundamentally transformed either by World War II, which is often my Soviet counterparts claim, that somehow the Soviet Union became, as my Russian friends would call, a normal country, normalny, or by détente, which a lot of the liberal American Sovietological community, because they deeply hoped that's what would happen, and many in the agency as well, deeply hoped that would happen, the hope somehow overrode the understanding of reality. And when détente started to break up, of course, because it was unexpected and it contradicted a lot of chosen nostrums, led to a lot of finger-pointing and blame. And the Carter administration, the chaos of the Carter administration's Soviet policy was actually a function of this crisis of ideas, a crisis of understanding of the Soviet Union. You had Marshal Schulman on one side advising Cyrus Vance, and then you had Bill Odom on the other advising Zbig Brzezinski in a total collision course. No wonder the Russians were confused about what was happening in the United States. But what was striking was when one looked at the materials was that although the Russians understood there was this complete, well, for a time, a standoff within the Carter administration as to where the Soviet Union was going, the Russians didn't think it really mattered. And this puzzled me when I looked at their documents. You know, surely they understood. And the more access I gained to internal Soviet documentation, the more puzzled I became. And you started to realize that the people you were studying were just deafened to a large part of the outside world. The fact that the Soviet General Staff only really realized that a nuclear war was unwinnable in 1983. I mean, Britain realized it was unwinnable in 1957, and we sort of gave up at that point, handed over to the United States. And many Americans, certainly Nixon and Kissinger, who weren't the softest, realized when Kissinger had the shock of, Nixon had the shock of the details of how to launch PSYOPs in '69, both of them were horrified by this. Nixon and Kissinger isn't exactly a great moralist, and Nixon, although a Quaker technically, I think that's all he was, technically a Quaker, was shocked by what responsibilities he held. So what was striking, even on initial encounter with the Russian archival materials, was that the Soviet leadership were sort of living on another planet, on another world. And ironically, Reagan, because he just didn't read anything he was given, I had a colleague who gave him briefings on Soviet SDI with 4x5 cards, and trying to keep the president's attention was extremely difficult because the president already felt he understood the essence. He didn't understand any of the detail, but somehow he felt he understood the essence. And in a way, he was more connected to the older guys running the Soviet Union than certainly with the younger ones. Now the materials, the research materials, the blockage from Moscow, which began in the, almost as soon as it had ended, began in the mid-90s, and thank goodness the Cold War International History Project, which John Gaddis pioneered, under my advice, I must say, historically correct, has managed to produce so many materials in English, but there are so many more and so many key materials, not necessarily on the crisis points. People tend to, I remember when I was a student of international relations at that august institution, which is going to be named after Colonel Gaddafi, the LSE in London, when I studied there, I remember one of our teachers, Coral Bell, who was a great friend of Henry Kissinger, or claimed to be, I don't know if she did, she started a series on studying crises in international relations. She felt that crises in international relations revealed their essence at any particular point. And they're obviously more readily identifiable than the day-to-day. And most books on the Cold War, certainly on the Russian side, tend to focus on the crises with that unwritten assumption, and I'm not sure that you actually understand the essence by looking at the crises. If you look now, you can find even more material on the Cuban Missile Crisis. The account of what happened at Novo-Ogarievo, at the dacha outside Moscow on that fateful day when Khrushchev was dealing with the last ultimatum from Kennedy, the rest of the Politburo were sort of shivering in fear while Khrushchev was thinking, you know, should I back down on this or not? And they were thinking about the imminence of war and nuclear strikes. And there's a description of how they felt by Brezhnev sitting there that day, and having read that description and those fears, you would have thought the last thing Brezhnev would ever do, were he in power, would to land the Soviet Union in major crises with the United States that in the end might lead anywhere close to thermonuclear war. And yet it was under Brezhnev, notionally, that troops were airlifted Cuban troops were airlifted into Angola, and now it was under Brezhnev. The decision was made to invade Afghanistan. It was under Brezhnev the decision was made to launch the to deploy, thank God not launch, although I saw one in the Aerospace Museum, the SS-20s, which wrecked détente with Germany and therefore the rest of Europe, that this should be done under a man who had experienced what they experienced during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Obviously, crises don't reveal the underlying currents of policy. In order to find more of these materials, thanks to a tip-off from Tim Garton-Ash, I found all the material, most of the materials I was looking for and was denied in Moscow were available in the Bundesarchiv in Berlin at Lichterfelde, traveling the hours on the S-Bahn to the U-Bahn to Lichterfelde, to read the almost monthly briefings sent from the Kremlin to Walter Ulbricht at the head of the SED, the German Communist Party, in Russian, and then Erich Honecker, later head of the German Communist Party, in German. These briefings gave their German colleague, strictly for his eyes only, an update into what the Kremlin was doing and how it saw the world. So all of a sudden, the day-to-day of Soviet foreign policy and the outlook was revealed. So one got a sense of normalcy rather than the peaks and the troughs of crises. Now, I'm not denying that in making the claim that I'm generally making, that really the Cold War origins lie with the ambitions of the October Revolution, that the Leninist mission to transform the world in the Soviet image was really what the driving undercurrent of Soviet policy throughout. And therefore, that's why you get the recurrence of things like the 1920s into the 1970s. But, of course, there were key differences. The key difference up to 1945, because the Soviet Union was otherwise employed up to 1945, was that from having an army of 562,000 in 1925, which is what they came to after the Civil War and demobilization, which could have... This army was actually inferior to what the Poles could produce, and they were terrified of the Poles in the late 20s, Pilsudski in particular. Well, Dzerzhinsky certainly was. Stalin less so. And by 1945, an army of 11 million. And an army of 11 million in Europe, which is on its face, and admittedly Russia was... in a bad way, but that never bothered Stalin so much. An army of 11 million combined with an ideology of transformationism represented a level of threat in terms of the balance of power in Europe that wasn't there before the war. Even in the 1930s, when the army was half that size, less than half that size, Russia faced a possibility of war on two fronts, from Japan as well, uncertainty about any possibility of allies, a lot of outdated equipment, and then Stalin decided to wipe out half the officer corps, half the defense specialists, most of the diplomatic corps, half of the Comintern, and most of the intelligence operations. So he wasn't exactly ready in June 1941, apart from psychologically being unready. But what he presented and what he represented in 1945 was very different. The argument was made at the time by my former supervisor, E.H. Carr at the Times, who knew a hell of a lot about Russia, but I think fundamentally misunderstood the ideological dimension, because Anglo-Saxon rationalists find Russia difficult to understand. I think we're fated always to get Russia wrong, because we project the way we run things and the way we think and the way our societies develop onto Russia, and we do the same for China at the moment, are bound to come unstuck. And the unsticking became obvious in the late 1940s. Carr assumed, as did Walter Lippmann and many others, with the key exceptions of Chip Bolan and George Kennan in Moscow, that Russia had become a normal country, that it had divested itself of the vestiges of revolution in the same way as France after 1815 had shed its revolutionary coverage. And some people had misunderstood that and kept looking to France for another revolution, a serious revolution, not 1830 or 48 or 1870, but a serious revolution. all the way up to the 1860s. And of course it never happened. We had Louis Napoleon, who was a joke. So they assumed that this was happening to Russia without the Napoleonic Wars. That was a key point. There were no Napoleonic Wars. The Bukharin option of 1920 was never continued. This was a mistake. If you look at how unprepared the British embassy in Moscow was in this period, with one proper language speaker, it was Chip Boland, then Llewellyn Thompson. The ambassador, poor old Averill Harriman, completely out of his depth with Roosevelt not answering phone calls, not knowing what was going on in Russia. And the British embassy hardly staffed by anybody with any Russian. And when one of them came home to the Home Department, to the Northern Department, the Foreign Office in 1945, he couldn't find anybody who spoke Russian in the department. He was on his own. That's how seriously we took Russia. Ironically, the only people who took Russia seriously was Luce, the paper tycoon, and he had people working on Russia during the war, trying to advise the president through Sumner Wells, and you know what happened to him. He got too close to somebody on a railway car in 1943 and got thrown out of the State Department for homosexuality, to Cordell Hull's relief. But unfortunately, he had finally caught up with what was happening in Russia. They didn't know, they didn't take advice from people who talked to Litvinov, who understood what was happening. And what was really happening was that the danger of the normalization of the Soviet Union into a normal country, the brakes were put on it by Stalin and by others around him, and then sent into reverse from 1946, the Zhdanovshchina, that you no doubt know about. So the Soviet Union was never allowed to normalize in the way that China may normalize under marketization. The Soviet Union was never allowed to go through this. Foreign trade was always monopolized. Contacts with foreigners. George Kennan's dentist was memorably shot. And contacts with foreigners after 1946 became dangerous. After Isaiah Berlin visited Akhmatova in Leningrad, and Berlin foolishly believed that Russia was normalizing up to that point, and he visited Akhmatova, I think, in January or February of 1946. And then when he came back to the embassy and then went home, you know, Stalin asked, what's that half nun, half spy? No, what's that half nun, half harlot doing with that spy Berlin? That was how it was. And then Akhmatova was sent into exile, and other people less fortunate were shot. And so the Soviet Union wasn't allowed to normalize. This is the key point. And after Stalin died, all the hopes rose. Churchill wanted a summit. My colleague has written great depth on this. Churchill wanted a summit. The leaders have changed. There's an opportunity. But the leaders who wanted change, the most unpleasant people, Malenkov and Beria, weren't allowed to change. So Beria was shot and Malenkov was sidelined. And then Khrushchev was brought in. Of course, Khrushchev had proposed all these changes. Khrushchev, that Bill Taubman started writing his great biography on and rather liked when he began it, hated him by the end because Khrushchev turned out not to be this great reformer. Khrushchev turned out to be, in fact, as Alan Dulles described it, even more dangerous than any of the other Soviet leaders. Somehow, whenever the hopes went forward to change, the car went into reverse, and you didn't want to be lying under it or standing behind it, as some American politicians were, or Kenneth Galbraith, hoping for convergence. Convergence ended up in the other direction, as we know. So all these disappointments, and the only sense, one could only really make sense by sort of getting under the skin of the old regime, and the only way of doing that is seeing all the classified documents, which thankfully we've seen a good deal of, and there will be many more, I hope, into the future. The collapse of the Soviet Union up to the point of 1989, although Gorbachev was doing his best to try to humanize this country, or the system that ran this country in this peculiar way. And remember that Gorbachev had studied with people at MGU like Dubček and his secretary, who'd been through the experience of de-Stalinization. Gorbachev was never fully in control of the machine. And when he went to go and see Mrs. Thatcher and discuss missiles, and Mrs. Thatcher had all the net assessment in front of her, probably borrowed from Washington, and they started arguing about numbers of missiles, and Gorbachev got his numbers wrong. And Mrs. Thatcher said, no, you've got this entirely wrong. He said, no, I've got them right. No, you've got them wrong, and here they are. And it has to be said, having looked at the Soviet numbers, which are available at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, because the guy who kept all the numbers in Moscow gave all his papers to the Hoover Institution for free. You can go and read them there, and you compare them with the American assessments. They're amazing. The Americans, the technical assessments are just right on in capacities of weapons and the numbers of the systems. Well, Gorbachev realized something was wrong, and Chernobyl showed him something was wrong with the system. And Alexander Yakovlev got so angry about this because the man Gorbachev put in charge of defense procurement and the rest rang up Yakovlev one day and said, do you know how many, I've forgotten what it was. It wasn't tanks, was it? It was some other system we've got. And Yakovlev gave a number, and he said, no, that's wrong. And Yakovlev said, it can't be wrong. I got it from the department. No, it's wrong. I'll give you the real number. They constantly found out that the apparat was working against them. And then if you read the interviews, which you can at the National Security Archive, which has done a great job following on the Cold War International History Project in unearthing material, interviews with those in the General Staff responsible for planning, not procurement, but for planning in the 1970s, Danilevich and these other generals, interviewed systematically by John Hines, from the OSD in the early 90s. And John was in charge of assessing the order of battle of the Red Army in Europe when I knew him in the 80s. I mean, a real numbers man. And John and a colleague went and interviewed these guys in Moscow. And what they told them about Soviet war planning in the 70s makes one's hair stand on end, that every assessment I ever heard of when I was working on SS-20s in the 80s turned out to be incredibly moderate in comparison with what Danilevich and the others tell you. You can read this stuff online at the National Security Archive. And that was my general conclusion from these years of looking at the Cold War and looking in depth at these documents. The Cold War turned out to be far worse than I thought it was. Every crisis I looked at turned out to be far more dangerous than I thought it was, and I couldn't believe I would turn out to find that the Cuban Missile Crisis was more dangerous than I thought it would be. And the danger of misunderstanding and lack of comprehension was far greater than I understood. And I have to say, we got through this thing, with a great deal of luck and a great deal of effective statesmanship that only becomes evident as the years advance. And we see the quality of statesmanship in more recent years. So I'll end on that note.
Thank you. Melissa?
I need to start with a disclaimer, and that is that I am a historian, not a specialist in diplomatic history or foreign policy. So there were many parts of your book, particularly, for example, discussions of the 1970s, the wars in Africa or proxy wars and so on, which were completely unknown to me. So I will not talk about things about which I feel I can bring nothing to the table, and that it was just a pleasure for me to learn about them in your book. I would like to make a couple of comments about the book and its manifold strengths, and then to put out a couple of questions that perhaps could get us going generally in a conversation. As far as the strengths of this book go, is that the sheer erudition is quite astonishing. There are so many notes drawing on such an incredible panoply of sources, archival sources, German, Russian, coming from various places in the United States, in the UK. There are memoirs, there are conversations that Professor Haslam conducted personally, oral histories, and so on. The archival pages of the bibliography are 12 pages alone. And that's a really astonishing richness of sources, and you feel it when you read the book, that the depth and command of the material, the periods. And then when you tell us that you had to cut out something like 30% for Yale, we know that there's even more that didn't come in there. Corresponding to the breadth of the source base is the scope of the lens, that you are looking at the entire Cold War, even if you weren't able to keep in all of the interwar materials that you wanted to have, and that it does look at the post-colonial world. It looks at the European conflict. There are, some of the sharp focuses on things like Berlin Wall or Cuban Missile Crisis, and then backing off to see the big picture. There's also balance here. You show the brutality and terror of the Stalin regime. You obviously are not drawing any moral equivalence between that and the regimes of the West, but at the same time, you don't give the Western powers a free pass. In noting use of subversion or cynical manipulation of other peoples to achieve proxy ends. You do not identify that as some sort of monopoly of Soviet policy. You also are scrupulous in not putting too much attention on personalities, even as you weave personality into the story, especially as when you note that to simply make Stalin primarily responsible for the start of the Cold War is to ignore a system, to ignore his advisors, to ignore things like lack of comprehension of the Western system, and it's also to fail to answer the question of why, if this was Stalin's undertaking, that it was not fundamentally changed after Stalin was gone, since they did change certain other things. Another thing that I found very compelling in the book was the degree to which you stressed that the Soviets' victory over the Germans in World War II and the enormous blood sacrifice that entailed gave them a sense of moral right to dominate the affairs of the continent. And I think that that's a really, really important insight in understanding how some of this goes forward. And I think you can also go back to Russian history and see that that has happened before. When the Russians played such a key role in defeating Napoleon and heading the coalition against Napoleon and pursuing him across Europe, and then helping to dictate the terms of the peace at Vienna, they very much had a feeling that they had earned a right to do this, not just by force of arms, but by the huge devastation that they had sustained at home in beating Napoleon. And I think that it was even more the case in World War II, but that's a very important thing for us to understand some of the Russian attitudes towards having a voice in how Europe is going to be disposed. So having rehearsed some of the really wonderful and fine features of this book, I wanted to bring up a couple of questions that I had. And one of them is something that you talked about in your remarks just now, and that was the importance of ideology. You say repeatedly in the book that you think that ideology was very important. And to quote you from your conclusion, it was this ideology that made all the difference in the Cold War as not being merely a struggle between empires, feeling that the ideological component was very important. You also talk about that there were sort of two threads to the Cold War, that it was initially a clash over the balance of power in Europe, but always there and outliving, to a degree, that clash was a clash of values, a clash of ideologies. And you feel that that was hugely important. And without denying the importance of ideology or suggesting that lip service to Marxism-Leninism was nothing but lip service, or perhaps nothing but lip service after Stalin, at the same time, it seems to me that you provide numerous examples, explored with great subtlety and detail, of clashes or decisions made or policies pursued that did not have very much to do with Marxism-Leninism or furthering world revolution, but that had to do with the state security of the USSR. This was attitudes towards the GDR and possibly giving up on the GDR to reunite Germany as long as it was going to be kept out of NATO, attitudes towards China in 1949, again in 1959 to 61, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the decision to go into Afghanistan. In your own analysis there, you highlight that the idea of sort of putting a wedge between fundamentalist Iran and Pakistan was hugely compelling to the Soviets, not making a socialist revolution in Afghanistan. So it seems to me that you provide a really, really strong case for how much Russia was acting like a great power or like a sovereign state that had identified interests that it believed that it had to defend and took very pragmatic realpolitik steps towards doing that. That's not, again, to say that ideology was completely unimportant. You also observe, as we all know in this room, that other great powers, such as the one we're in right now, have promoted authoritarian dictatorships, and that does not necessarily mean that we would believe that our commitment to democracy is merely lip service, but that perhaps sometimes powers do things that run contrary to their professed values. All the same, it seems like the case you make for realpolitik is stronger than the case that you make for the ideological determinants. And the second point that I wanted to bring up, which is related to that also, is as an expert or a specialist, let's say, on Russian nationalism, I was surprised that Russian nationalism per se didn't seem to figure very much in the discussion, especially when there really is a resurgence in Russian nationalism. You remark very interestingly that Molotov never liked to refer to Russia. Molotov always referred to the Soviet Union when he talked, whereas Stalin, especially after the war, was increasingly inclined to talk about Russia and Russians. And I think most scholars would say that a distinctively Russian nationalism is a much more important part of the cultural landscape, thinking identities and perhaps a motive for actions after the end of World War II. And certainly we see it becoming more important in the 1970s. In all sorts of ways. And we know from archives, from our own personal experiences in Russia, and so on, that more and more of the elite felt that Russian nationalism had been unduly diminished by the Soviet system. Gil Rosman can talk about Russian nationalism as well. We have another specialist on this issue. But they felt that Marxism-Leninism in the Soviet system that there was not a Russian Communist Party. There was a Communist Party of the Soviet Union and a Belarusian Communist Party and an Uzbek Communist Party. All the republics had a Communist Party of their very own, except Russia itself, the largest republic of the Federation. That Russia did not have a national capital. Moscow is the capital of the Soviet Union, not of Russia. And there was a strong feeling that Russian interests, Russian culture, Russian needs had been unduly slighted or ignored in this system. And correspondingly, I think that Russian nationalism, as well as perceived great power self-interest, played into, flavored, colored certain policy pursuits or foreign policy decisions. And I would enjoy hearing more about what you would have to say on that. Finally, I had a question that I wanted to ask you, which you've already partially answered in your remarks just now, and that had to do with the source base. We all know that when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Russian Federation was organized, that historians and scholars believed that an archival bonanza was about to occur and that we would be like so many ill-dressed children in a candy shop rummaging around, seeing all the things that we had never seen before. And in some cases, that was true. And in some cases, that archival access has largely continued. And certainly, it never was as true for your field as might have been hoped. And as you indicated, it started sizing up already in the late 90s, certainly under the Putin era. And so I was wondering if you could tell us about any, or at least one issue that you had hoped to find archival materials on and that you were not able to, and felt that that made a difference on how you were able to think about or approach or talk about that particular issue. And with that, I'll stop.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa, for these very thoughtful comments to get our discussion going here. I'm actually really glad we asked you to comment on the book. I think it adds a perspective that we might not have gotten from yet another Cold Warrior who we could have lined up to give comments on this important book. So, Jonathan, would you like to respond to Melissa first?
I don't want to foreshorten discussion. I think on ideology, I would just say that had Russia, Soviet Union, behaved as a normal state, then when it took over the countries of East and Central Europe, it would have done what Litvinov and E.H. Carr and Lippmann hoped. That's to say, take over their foreign policy, take over their defense policy, but leave the domestic system intact, or at least for the locals to decide. And Trotsky wrote a wonderful piece that's never been translated into English, although I'd give an excerpt in the book, in 1940 in the Bulletin of the Opposition. Trotsky, who'd given up on Stalin as a revolutionary, was amazingly surprised when, after Soviet troops entered Poland and then subsequently the Baltic states and Bukovina, that they Sovietized these countries exactly in their own image. You know, first thing you do, create collective farms, sovkhozy, you know, start putting people in concentration camps, you know, the whole works. Put the local communists in charge, the whole works. They did it again. They did it carefully, slowly, catchy monkey, in 1945-6, and I've quoted Beria, Molotov and others, the reasons why they were careful, particularly in Czechoslovakia. But when it came to it, they did it. And Stalin kept complaining to Gomulka he was being too slow at doing it in Poland, for example. So I would just say that it was terribly difficult. So in other words, they couldn't conduct international relations the ordinary way. If they couldn't feel if they had to control somewhere, it has to be transformed. There's this transformationism that's the value added. It's the same in Ethiopia and these places. They kept asking the Ethiopians, so you're becoming a communist country, right? So when's your first party congress? And the Ethiopians said, just hand over the aid. We'll do one next year. And this went on and on. They didn't try it with Gaddafi. Russian nationalism, yes, I agree. I mean, you see it more re-emerge, with Rodina appears in Pravda, Motherland starts to appear in 1934. The Red Army Officer Corps have to do dancing lessons from 1935. And my friend Dashachev, who was the son of a Russian Soviet general, when I met him in the 80s, had the comportment of, a czarist officer of aristocracy. He held his head in such a way. It was amazing. But, as you kept saying, it was, as your Russian friends say and everybody else, it was slighted and ignored in the system. That's why Russian nationalism is so big today. Russians felt they gave up for empire. They surrendered their individual identity for the identity of others. The All-Russian Communist Party was renamed Soviet, but it was the All-Russian Communist Party Bolshevik. They were forced to shed the Russianism in order to control the Soviet Empire, and then with the Soviet Empire in a state of semi-collapse, as doubtless you knew in your visits and I knew, they thought, well, something's got to be rescued, and that would be Russia and Yeltsin's moment with the Russian flag and all the rest of it. So I agree, but I think it reinforces what I'm saying, which was that Russian nationalism was suppressed. I remember endless conversations with Russians. I was going there backwards and forwards from 1968 at any opportunity, even though they didn't want me there. The Russian taxi drivers moaning about giving aid to Arabs. They just loathed them. Lomonosov University, which was devoted to this, aid to the Third World, the Russians loathed this. It was anti-Russian. Anti-Semitism, it wasn't peculiarly anti-Russian, but it was really unpleasant. And you used to meet Jews there who were forced to drink industrial alcohol in order to survive a train ride from Leningrad to Moscow without being beaten up. They had to prove they were Russian by swallowing vast quantities of vodka and industrial alcohol until they got to the western end of the train. So yes, Russian, but it was suppressed, and that's why it's exploded. Because Russia was never a country, it was never a state, it was always an empire, it was Russian. So it had to come back to that. Sources, yes, I mean, there was so much that, well, if you'd asked me in the mid-90s, I'd present you with a long list, most of which I found in East Berlin, thank goodness, so most everything. And I remember my friend Bob Conquest, who's still going, when the Soviet Union collapsed, he said to me, Jonathan, it's all over. The Russians are now going to write their own history. I shan't bother anymore. I thought, oh, God, no, another shift of career. But, of course, it wasn't so easy for them, and it's terrible for them now, and it's been bad for them for over 10 years. My Russian colleagues are forced to work in American archives, and the ones who have German can manage Berlin because they get very little out of their own archives. But there are officially published sources, like this series of 2 volumes on the Middle East, without which I couldn't have written the book, which are wonderfully done. And there's a lot of intelligence material that's come out subsequently. But I could probably compile another list.
Thank you. Jonathan, if I can just, you're here at the Wilson Center at the Cold War Project. This is not the first book on the Cold War and on Russia's Cold War that we have launched here. So let me press you a little bit more. If you could just place your book in the historiographical context. There have been a number of master narratives. John Gaddis, Mel Leffler, who is here with us today, Arnie Vestad, Vladislav Zuba. Could you bring your differences, your with these master narratives into a little sharper focus for us here today?
I guess, I mean, what I've tried to do is the boring thing, which is extremely difficult to interest publishers in. Thank goodness Yale took this, and they had to take it with a subsidy, because I was trying to provide a seamless narrative of this whole affair. So it matters, I think, what Khrushchev thought of Japan and why there isn't a Russo-Japanese peace treaty even today. They're still technically at war, I suppose. I think the sort of intricacies of German policy and relations with Erich Honecker and Gorbachev are important. Because, for example, if poor old Erich Honecker wasn't allowed to visit his family in Germany, in West Germany, 3 times denied permission to go by Gorbachev. And so I puzzle over how people could sustain the idea that Ulbricht could tell Khrushchev that he was going to build a wall in Berlin if the General Secretary of the East German Party had to get permission to travel. And so, in other words, by doing a lot of the sort of the boring end rather than the fascinating end of the crises, you get an idea of what is normal, what was normal all the way through. And as I mentioned, the sources in East Germany had not been used systematically, and were it not for Tim Garton-Ash, I wouldn't have known they were even there. And also by drawing back, I think, before World War II, to see what was normal in East-West relations, because the 30s were very abnormal, and wartime was, unfortunately, when you look at the Soviet materials, they saw it as a continuation of conflict. So without looking at 39, 40, and 41, you can't place the rest. So the issue is really one of context and scope, and I don't mean to denigrate other work done. Obviously, everybody who succeeds someone else in writing history, any form of history, is standing on the shoulders of others, and you know, one subconsciously absorbs so much by attending your conferences and those of others, and by reading the works of those of others. But I do think getting inside the animal matters, and it's terribly difficult getting some sort of Fingerspitzengefühl about a foreign country. I mean, I'm married to a German, and I still don't feel I fully understand Germany. Is it an Oriental country, as some German Mr. Winkler maintains, or is it a Western country? And when I take my shoes off to go in the house, I realize it's almost Oriental, although the weather makes that sense. But in Britain, our weather's even worse, and we keep our boots on. You know, so these issues, it takes a long time getting into them. And for example, when dealing with China or Korea, I always felt that I was nowhere near getting under the skin. So I think it matters living there, going there, being there too much, and talking to Russians, and not sitting in libraries, but hanging out in the bars, because you get a sense of the country. So I hope some of that is in there. And also my personal contacts with Dashichev and Yerofeev and others, that made a huge difference. If Yerofeev hadn't explained what it was like to work for Molotov, and what it was like to interpret for Stalin, and how they thought, I would have had to have sort of tried to work it out from books and paper, which is extremely difficult. And the same for Western diplomacy, because a lot of Western diplomacy is not to be found in archives.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll open it up for your comments and questions. This event is being webcast live, so if I could ask you to please wait for the mic over there, and also if you'd like, state your name and affiliation if you'd like. We'll start with Don Wolfensberger.
Don Wolfensberger with the Wilson Center. You mentioned the extent to which Soviet leaders, even toward the end, were sort of blind or in denial, and the extent to which after World War II they were sort of impatient with imposing their ideology on Eastern Europe. But going back to the beginning, at what point do you think the leaders themselves saw that the ideology that they originally believed in was going to have to change? In other words, you mentioned in your book how early on Lenin abandoned the idea of world revolution sort of taking place after the after the Bolsheviks successfully pulled theirs off. And I think with each party Congress, you see adjustments being made in that ideology. But was there still a firm belief in the underpinnings of that ideology?
Yes, it's a fascinating area you've touched on. That's worthy of a book just in itself, and one can only skirt around it. Well, Litvinov was the first to realize that world revolution was a non-starter. I mean, Louis Fisher gives that, and he was very close to Litvinov in the early period, 1920. He realized, but he saw Russia as a state, and it will become normal, and he'd work with the man most likely to make it a normal state, who seemed like Stalin, who in the late 20s was welcomed by the Foreign Office as a much relieved substitute for that dangerous man Trotsky. Mind you, Trotsky was pretty dangerous. Next, and Litvinov maintained this all the way through, and he got him into a great deal of trouble. Malenkov and Beria clearly did not believe in all this. And Malenkov's origins sort of indicate that he wasn't exactly a son of the workers, although one of his parents was. And Beria, you wouldn't have left your child in a room with him, would you? Certainly not your daughter, from what I gather. These people had no scruples and no beliefs at all. Stalin liked such people, so he clustered them a bit. Vyshinsky was another one, ex-Menshevik. So Stalin used these people quite carefully. It's striking, though, who wasn't. I mean, you read Molotov, Chuyev's 140 besied s Molotovым. Molotov remembers. And I read that in California, I remember, in hot weather, and it sent shivers down my spine. The Molotov still held these things right the way through into his death at a very old age. But then the change with Gorbachev, by the time, well, in my visits to Russia, in the 70s, no young person I met believed in anything. Gorbachev appears to certainly have believed, Andropov would not have chosen. Andropov distinguished between Bolsheviks and communists. Bolsheviks were the real thing and had integrity, and he chose Gorbachev early on as an up-and-coming man. And the rest were scoundrels. Shows you something. Brezhnev didn't believe in much. Brezhnev believed in hunting, fishing, skiing, fast cars. But he was doing pretty well, so why should he tell anyone? He just thought a lot of the ideology was garbage, but he served it. In other words, you ask the question, how many archbishops of Canterbury really believe in it all? Or how many popes? Well, it doesn't want to go into that. Certainly how many local priests. But Yakovlev, certainly, his exchange to the United States, to Columbia University and Alec Dallin's classes on the Comintern certainly shifted him and got him into trouble. And then his stay in Canada. And he was the key figure. He was xenophobic. He didn't like the United States. You know, he found it was atrocious, the culture. But he wanted to modernize Russia, and he wanted everything America had except American values and Americans. It was like the Japanese view of America. How can we use it? So it was a transformationist from within. But I'm always struck by how late people were to convert. Dashachev, who was a great friend of mine who was early on into United Germany, wasn't converted till he was disillusioned in the mid-60s by being attacked and thrown out of the army for talking about 1941. So the regime gradually alienated more and more key people. But mostly at the top there was every vested interest in belief. There was no interest in, taking a side turn. This would have been extremely damaging. You didn't know who was spying on you. It wasn't as bad. Nobody talked openly. They used to say, when they want to have an open talk with you, это не телефонный разговор. This isn't a telephone conversation, meaning it will be bugged. When Kosygin wanted to have private conversations, he went to walk up on the Sparrow Hills, and he was Prime Minister. So it tells you something, and it wasn't as bad as East Germany, but you were careful. And so even if you did have disbelief, you didn't want to share it. And Andropov's innovation of psychiatric asylums for unbelievers, because unbelievers must be mad, was an incredible deterrent. And in fact, the number of dissidents declined under Andropov. And those who, Bukovsky and the others who spoke out, got injected with sulfur drugs, and he's in a terrible state, has been ever since. It's a miracle some of them survived. So there was no credit to unbelief. And so one way or the other, the system staggered forward. And Gorbachev believed very strongly that he could transform it back to the Leninist model, because he had no idea of the reality, almost to the very end. He got rid of Yakovlev. Yakovlev was an agent of influence of the CIA.
Right. Yes, if you could wait for the microphone, please.
Dan Lieberman, unaffiliated. Thanks so much for really interesting books, and thank you for a very stimulating rapport, Ms. Stockdale. It really was very stimulating. Of course, I have not read the book, and I haven't researched the archives as you have. Of course, you say that Soviet Union, Russia, the Cold War really started in 1918, that they are responsible for the Cold War, but yet there is some conflicting issues that were kind of apparent. Let me go over a few. Soviet Union occupied Iran, northern Iran, just after the war, and they actually thought it was part of their territory, and historically it was, but Truman asked them to leave, and they left. They occupied Austria, but they left. They occupied Czechoslovakia, but they left. They came back later on in 1948 when they thought that Czechoslovakia was changing. They did not help Greece at all, as far as I know, in the 1946 war. They did not help any of the communist parties in France and Italy. In Italy, the Communist Party was 35%, and legally they should have been the ruling party. On the other hand, the U.S. did help the Greeks fighting against the communists. They did interfere in all of the elections in France and in Italy. They did establish a Marshall Plan, which brought all of Europe into the U.S. orbit. And, of course, they had the Berlin airlift, and to Soviet Union, to Stalin, they couldn't even understand what was the powers doing in Berlin. I mean, it was the center. They were just spying, that they thought. But then you had the airlift, and they let the airlift go. They didn't invade Berlin. So by 1948, you also had the speech of Churchill in 1946, the Iron Curtain speech. So by 1948, the Soviet Union had really shown quite a lot that they were willing to cooperate, and the U.S. had shown the opposite. So it seemed that the die was cast by 1948, and the claim that it was all the fault of the Soviet Union has some conflicting evidence, doesn't it?
Oh, yes, there's absolutely. There are a lot of books out there. But I think to address the early ones, I don't think any country's foreign policy is 100% consistent in anything. It can't be, because foreign policy, by definition, is an arena almost beyond your control. The second point would be made. Stalin prided himself on a realpolitik. He didn't believe in reasons of state in the manner of the West, but he believed in realpolitik. That's to say, power is real. You ignore an imbalance of power at your peril. Stalin, therefore, and in my book you'll find him saying this. He briefed the Yugoslavs on how to use power, little knowing what they turn into, of course. That where you're overexposed, where you've got an indefensible position, where the position you've adopted will damage your policy elsewhere, as in North Iran, you get out. If you can't sustain it, you've got to be pragmatic in that. What was to be gained? The Azeris gain a few more chunks of territory. He decided that wasn't worth it. Molotov always opposed taking northern Iran. Molotov thought this was ridiculous. He was a Europe first man. It just annoyed the British, annoyed the Americans, and got the Russians a lot of sand. Austria 55. Now that was in the air in the 40s. But Molotov wouldn't have anything to do with it when it became a possibility in the early 50s after Stalin died. He sabotaged it for 2 years consistently. Yerofeev, who was working for him, is very explicit on this, as are others, and as are the documents. It was done in 55, hopefully as an enticement to the rest of the world. This was the era of neutralism, non-alignment, Indonesia, India, Egypt, all the rest of it. This was one possible path. Austria, what was it worth? It really wasn't worth much strategically. It wasn't in the northern tier. Pragmatism prevailed there. Czechoslovakia, well, as you say, they went in 58. In February 48, Stalin sent a deputy foreign minister with instructions to the Czech Communist Party to seize power without the Red Army. And the Czech Communist leader Gottwald said, no, just send in the army from the east, thank you very much. And so, no, you do it yourself. He was scared to death. And eventually they did it. They did, and then, of course, the Red Army could come in safely afterwards. This was the other way. Where the enemy's weak, you attack. Where the enemy's attack, you pull back. It's a sort of Tai Chi thing, really. And it makes sense in international relations, whatever your ideology. Greece, no, they did help the Greeks, and it's indicated in my book where and how, and it wasn't straight out. It was under pressure. There were arguments about it. One of the reasons why Stalin came into dispute with the Yugoslavs was because he believed the Yugoslavs were going to try and build their own communist federation, Southeast Europe, with the Greeks in there, and the Albanians, whether the Albanians wanted it or not. So there were intra-communist problems there. France and Italy, no, they were given instructions in 44. We have the documents as to when Togliatti was due to go back, asked to go back to Italy after the Americans landed at Salerno. He went to see Stalin. Stalin told him what would happen, that he'd got to make friends with Marshal Badoglio, who was a fascist, that he had to accept the revival of the monarchy in Italy, etc. And Togliatti was, So he went back and had to explain this to the comrades who weren't happy. They wanted a revolution. Maurice Torres was told the same thing a little later. I'm sorry, but de Gaulle's people are going to take power at the end of the war. The British want that. I'm not getting in there. As a result, the communists in both countries never succeeded in taking power. Berlin, 48, well, they tried to take Berlin. They tried to take Berlin essentially to forestall the unification of Germany on Western terms. So this was a tit for tat. They weren't really ready to cooperate. It's very clear from the whole pattern of negotiations. Yerofeev describes what it was like when the new foreign ministry was formed in 46 on the back of the Commissariat for Foreign Affairs. The ideology they were supposed to act with, the instructions of how they were to behave, the contacts they weren't to have with the West. And when Molotov stepped out of line, because he was slightly more moderate than Stalin in 45, in September 45, to be a bit more pragmatic, Stalin accused him almost of working for the other side. It was no longer dear Vyacheslav, it was dear Molotov. And Beria, of course, sitting at his side. And when Burns came forward with a proposal that would in some ways give an American-Soviet guarantee of a non-revival of a post-war revanchist Germany, Stalin threw it in their face because he wasn't interested in containing Germany, he was interested in containing the United States. And an early section I tried to demonstrate that the fear of the rise of the United States was core to Stalin's view, that if the only way you could dominate Europe was having control of the seas, and the only power that controlled the seas was the United States. So I don't in no way underestimate Stalin's dislike of and concern for the rise of American power, which was real and which was there and emerging on the back of lucubrations It wasn't just a reaction to Soviet power, as Kennan believed. There was something else going on in the world that Stalin was reacting to. This doesn't excuse anything. It helps explain what previously, I think, had been inexplicable. So it's not just a matter of what's in Stalin's mind. You're quite right. There's a lot of tit for tat and reaction. But the willingness to negotiate, Stalin believed if he held out as long as he could to the possibility of World War III, he could win. That the West was weak, that Truman was weak, that the Americans did not have the will to power that Churchill had. Churchill was in the wrong country. Britain had run out. And there wasn't a Churchill in America. And so you see very much this thing, the Russians, Stalin saying, now I'm dealing with Churchill, I better watch out, because Churchill's a tricky character. Roosevelt was nice. Roosevelt was a pussycat. But Churchill, that was a problem. So there are a lot of subtleties there, but I think Soviet policy makes more sense understanding how they saw the United States in the period.
Thank you. Mel Leffler?
Hi. I've only had a few minutes to look at your book, but I'll preface my question by saying that I'm immediately very troubled by the way you describe the arguments of other people and the way, rather than engage their arguments, you label them as leftists or liberals or rightists, etc. But I'm even more puzzled immediately by the way you use evidence to reach your conclusions. So you tell us that the superiority of your interpretation stems from your deep engagement with Russian sources and your real knowledge of Russia. Not long ago, very recently, Svetlana Sevronskaya and Tom Blanton have published a very big book on masterpieces of history, so-called, is the title of the book, with extensive essays and many, many documents. I doubt if anyone in the world, including yourself, has seen more Russian documents than Svetlana Sevronskaya, and she's arguably as deeply immersed in the culture of Russia as you are. And yet she and Blanton reach totally different conclusions about the impact of Ronald Reagan's military buildup and the role of SDI. So my question is the following, a very specific question. How is it that you and Sevronskaya Blanton look at the same documents and reach such drastically different conclusions? And why is your interpretation of pretty much the same documents so different than theirs?
Well, I can answer that on two levels, I suppose. Historians are no different from economists, so if you gather them all into one room, depending on how many there are, you'll get so many different interpretations. So, and it's not for me as the author of a work to demand of my readers that they believe what I've written. I just ask you to read it, and by all means then read every other work that you can find and draw your own judgments. It's not for me to draw judgments. I'm having dinner with Tom and Svetlana tonight, so I'll put it to them. Just read the book and make your own judgments. The arguments about Reagan and SDI, I suppose, I was, as Mel knows, because I first met him here when I was working at SAIS in the mid-'80s, and because, unlike the successful project of the Cold War History Program, I found it terribly difficult working as a historian in Washington, because whenever I went to a party, this was in the Reagan era, working half a mile from the White House, everybody asked me what I thought the Russians would do next. And so I started working on the origins of the SS-20 deployment. And I suppose being 60 years old does give one 40 years of experience of Russia, one way or the other. And this is where I met the guys in the Office of Secretary of Defense who had access to things that only now I've got access to. And frankly, my judgment about the SS-20 deployment and why the Russians climbed down in the end, due to the fear of SDI, that was published in 1988. I would just say that those conclusions are correct by the material that's subsequently been produced. So I'm not going to get into an argument about whether I, as a historian, am better than Svetlana or than Tom Blanton. I'm not going to get into that argument. Generally speaking, I would say that I've highlighted where I differ from other historians in order to get people who are unfamiliar with the field, because although the project's done a great job, and Mel, yourself and others done a great job in proselytizing the study of the Cold War, a lot of people will approach it ab initio, and it's a way of getting into what the arguments are all about. And those who fundamentally disagree with me must then review the book and expose my shocking misuse of evidence and my lack of ability as a historian. And I challenge you all to run away and do that immediately. And I look forward to the reviews subsequently, and I am looking forward to a future debate in print. I would very much welcome such a thing. And there will be reviews from Russia which doubtless will attack me in a similar manner.
Okay, other questions? Yes.
I've only gotten to the northern, Alfred Friendly. My affiliation is I'm putting up with him this evening, and have in the past. Every other page in the first 50, almost, or from 30 to 50, you note that Stalin read everything that Churchill wrote, every minute from the cabinet, every correspondence between Washington and London. When did we begin to read what even what Gorbachev was saying to his allies in the Politburo or elsewhere? Did we ever? Because the understanding that you get, and certainly during the war, and that fed Stalin's view of what Europe ought to be like or could be like at the end of the war, we didn't have that intelligence about his thinking, did we ever?
No, exactly right. It was a rather one-sided relationship where they're reading your mail or your diary and you're not reading theirs. It doesn't produce a good relationship. I guess, I had one weird experience in the East German archives where I, as any inefficient worker in archives like myself knows, is I came across a document. I thought I've read this before. I've called up the same number twice, and I had a limited time span working in archives, and I thought, oh, I've done it again. So I kept reading the document, and it was an assessment sent from Moscow to Walter Ulbricht about the situation. I think it was Ulbricht, or it would have been Erich Honecker in the Middle East in the early 70s, 73 war, and that. I thought, oh, God, I've done it again. And then I suddenly realized I checked. I hadn't called up this document before. I thought, where have I read it? And I looked up the electronic CIA archive and found that I don't mean to cast aspersions on the agency, but some analyst hadn't bothered to paraphrase the intercept and had just quoted it because it was beautifully written. I think my students do this occasionally. And it was beautifully written, and I could match it up. So the agency certainly intercepted at some point some of these briefings that went to the east. There were softer ends of encryption and decryption on the Soviet side. But other than that, I would distinguish between intelligence about political intelligence, intelligence about intentions and policy, and intelligence about capabilities. The U.S., after the troubles over the bomber gap and the missile gap of the mid-50s, late 50s, the intelligence on Soviet weapon systems and numbers of rockets and the rest of it was really tremendous. By the early 70s, they had it. And when you look at the material from the Military Industrial Commission of the Central Committee, which you can see at Stanford, with all the numbers of missiles, then they had at the top basically what the Americans will know and what they won't know in sections. And everything that could be technically, they assumed the Americans knew. So that was perfect. The others depended on defection. They depended on the use of technology to, well, for example, they had this, I've forgotten the name of it, it's all written up, the interception of conversations taking place in cars leaving the Kremlin. This was a big scoop from the mid-60s to the early 70s. The Russian embassy was doing it to the new State Department buildings when I was here in the late 80s, so they found out from the new embassy the vibrations on the glass. The Russians even knew this was happening, but didn't know what to do about it because the old men wouldn't stop talking. So they knew a lot of nitty-gritty. Certainly when I was here trying to work on the SS-20 during the 80s, nobody from the agency would talk to me because they were on lie detectors. The DIA weren't. DIA would talk to me a bit. CIA wouldn't. Clearly they knew something, mainly from defectors. But then I found, and it's in the book, the Cray 1A computer system that comes in the late 70s under Carter, broke a whole series of codes and ciphers going back in time. One of my friends actually got access to it and told me stuff about the Korean War. And I said to him, have you been reading the Cold War International History Bulletin? Because it was the only other place he could have known, because he only read English. And he said, no, what's that? And I suddenly realized, because he'd been working at the agency where he'd read it, so they'd gone back and looked at all that stuff, including Venona, which they claim was over in 80. So in other words, the break open of codes and ciphers only seriously began in the late 70s. It helped Brzezinski and Odom to trick the Russians into Afghanistan in 79 because they knew how the Russians feared going in. I don't think they ever had access to Politburo minutes. Nobody defected at that level. So the access was patchy, but it was very good up to 80, and then there were one or two other exercises under Gorbachev, then there were defections. So the material under Gorbachev was a good deal better. But basically it was an asymmetrical relationship. But when the Cambridge Five broke up and when Philby and Maclean fled to Moscow, of course, they suddenly went blank in the early 50s. But then Khrushchev picked up, there was the Lonsdale spy ring, there was the Portland spy ring, there was a whole series of things. So it was always slightly asymmetrical. The point about intelligence, as the specialists will tell you, is that it's not what you get, it's what you do with what you get. And that was the problem with political intelligence on the other side. Are you going to tell Andropov that there isn't a problem from Ronald Reagan, that he's really bluffing, that all those interceptions didn't add up to anything? Just as Stalin wouldn't believe that MI5 wasn't plotting against the British Communist Party and the MI6 didn't have agents in Moscow. And when Mr. Blunt, cousin of the Queen, the then Queen, informed Moscow that they didn't have any agents in Moscow, the instructions were, don't believe Blunt. Blunt must be a double agent. So you get into the... So having the intelligence doesn't mean it does you any good, I suppose I'm saying.
Thank you. We're just about out of time. Jonathan, let me just ask you, as the last question, in one sentence or two, having written about Russia's Cold War, what is the most important thing to understand about Russia's Cold War and understanding Russia today?
Well, I think actually my colleague is far better at answering that, in the sense that Russia today is not the Russia of the Cold War, whatever people say. But some bad practices linger. You know, you must have teenagers who were reformed and slip back occasionally. Countries don't change quickly, they change generationally. The Foreign Intelligence Service is more or less the same. The FSB is not much different from its predecessor, the first department of KGB. But there are other things that have fundamentally changed. The place is unrecognizable. You can have telephone conversations. The West is there in Russia in some form, and Russia is re-emerging and finding itself, and it's finding itself with great difficulty. New bad practices have spread up, anti-Semitism, fascism, all these ugly things rear their head. But it's on a process of development which is more organic. It's not doctrinally restricted, and that gives some hope for foreign relations. There's more give there than there was ever in the past, I would say.
Thank you. Let's give a round of applause for our two panelists.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all for your comments and questions. We're adjourned. Thank you.
I mean, not only did I cut out a lot of the interwar, but the big drawback of taking Russia like 1812, 1815 is such a good point. But
Yeah, no, I mean, my God, there's
thank you so much for hosting it. You did a great job for that. Hey, I wondered if I'd see you. It's nice to see you.
Thank you. Are you by yourself?
I'm done. The kids are